The autumn wind swept across the vast Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of wild grass and the promise of an early winter. At the remote train station in Clearwater Junction, a solitary figure stepped onto the wooden platform, her worn, leather suitcase clutched tightly in trembling hands. Isabella Martinez had traveled over 1,000 miles to meet a man she had never seen, carrying nothing but a faded photograph and the desperate hope that her new life would be better than the nightmare she was fleeing. She had not smiled in 3 years. Not since the day her world had collapsed in ways that still haunted her dreams. But standing on that wind-swept platform, watching the steam from the departing train dissipate into the endless Montana sky, Isabella was about to discover that sometimes the most broken hearts can find healing in the most unexpected places. This is the story of how a mail-order bride who had forgotten how to trust and a kind-hearted rancher who had given up on love found each other in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, and how their meeting would change not just their lives, but the entire community of Clearwater Junction forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November of 1887 brought an unusually harsh cold snap to Clearwater Junction, Montana, and with it came Isabella Martinez, stepping off the 347 westbound train with all her worldly possessions contained in a single battered suitcase. The platform was nearly deserted, except for the station master, an elderly man named Harold Peterson, who'd been watching trains come and go for the better part of 30 years, and a tall figure in a brown coat standing near the telegraph office. Isabella's dark eyes scanned the platform nervously, searching for someone who might match the description in the letter she had memorized word for word. Thomas Mitchell, 6 feet tall, brown hair, will be wearing his Sunday coat and carrying a sign with, "Your name." But the man by the telegraph office held no sign, and Isabella felt her stomach tighten with the familiar sensation of uncertainty that had become her constant companion. The journey from Chicago had taken 4 days, 4 days of sitting in uncomfortable train seats while watching the landscape transform from bustling cities to endless prairies, from familiar urban chaos to an isolation so complete it made Isabella's chest constrict with something between fear and relief. She had spent those hours reviewing the letters that had brought her here, the carefully worded correspondence between herself and Thomas Mitchell, a cattle rancher who had advertised for a wife in the Chicago Tribune. His letters had been polite, practical, and reassuring in their straightforwardness. He needed a wife to help manage his household and provide companionship in the isolated life of ranching. She needed safety, security, and a fresh start, far from the memories that haunted her sleep. It seemed like a fair exchange, a business arrangement that might, with time and patience, grow into something resembling contentment. But now, standing on the platform with the Montana wind cutting through her thin wool coat, Isabella wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The vastness of the landscape was overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. In Chicago, even at her lowest moments, she had been surrounded by the noise and activity of urban life. Here, the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, echoing in her ears. "Miss Martinez?" The voice came from behind her, deep and gentle, with the slight drawl she had come to associate with men who spent their lives working outdoors. Isabella turned slowly, her body tensing with the automatic defensiveness that had kept her alive for the past 3 years. The man approaching her was indeed tall, with brown hair visible beneath a well-worn hat. But there was something in his manner that immediately set him apart from what Isabella had expected. Thomas Mitchell moved with deliberate care, keeping a respectful distance as he approached, his hands visible and empty of any potential threat. Most importantly, His eyes held a kindness that Isabella had almost forgotten existed in the world. "I'm Thomas Mitchell," he said, stopping several feet away from her and removing his hat in a gesture that spoke of ingrained courtesy. "I apologize for not having a sign. The station master told me there was only one lady passenger on today's train, so I figured that had to be you." Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Up close, Thomas Mitchell was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with weathered hands that spoke of hard work and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a man who had known happiness, even if recent years had tested him. His Sunday coat was clean but well worn, and Isabella noticed he had made an effort to present himself well for their first meeting. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult," Thomas continued, his tone careful and respectful. "It's a long way. I'm from Chicago, and I know the accommodations on the western routes aren't always the most comfortable." "It was fine," Isabella managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt rusty in her throat, and she realized it had been days since she had spoken to another person, beyond the basic necessities of purchasing meals and confirming train connections. Thomas studied her face with the same careful attention. She was giving him, and Isabella saw something shift in his expression. Whatever he had been expecting when he came to meet his mail-order bride, the reality of her appearance seemed to surprise him. Isabella knew what he was seeing. A woman who looked older than her 23 years, with dark circles under her eyes and a wariness that made her hold herself like someone expecting a blow. "Well then," Thomas said finally, his voice maintaining that same gentle tone, "let me help you with your bag, and we'll get you settled. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch, and Sarah's been preparing a welcome dinner all afternoon." "Sarah?" Isabella asked, alarm creeping into her voice. The letters had never mentioned another woman at the ranch. "My housekeeper," Thomas explained quickly, apparently reading the concern in her expression. "She's been with the family for 15 years, since before my parents passed. She's excited to have another woman around the place, someone to talk to besides me and the ranch hands." Isabella nodded, feeling slightly foolish for her immediate suspicion. In Chicago, the presence of unexpected people had always meant danger, but she was beginning to understand that life in Montana operated by different rules she would need to learn if she was going to survive here. Thomas reached for her suitcase, moving slowly enough that Isabella could have stopped him if she wanted to. When she didn't protest, he lifted it easily, testing its weight with surprise. "This is everything?" he asked, and Isabella caught something in his tone that might have been concern. "Yes," Isabella replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. She knew how it must look. A woman arriving to start a new life with possessions that could fit in a single small suitcase. But everything else, her books, her mother's jewelry, the paintings she had loved, had been sold or abandoned in her desperate flight from Chicago. "Well, Sarah will enjoy taking you shopping in town," Thomas said, and Isabella realized he was trying to put her at ease rather than judge her circumstances. "She's been complaining for months that the general store doesn't carry enough variety for women's needs." They walked together toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 horses, Thomas maintaining that careful distance that showed his awareness of her discomfort with proximity. The wagon was well maintained, with a bench seat, cushioned, with what appeared to be hand-sewn pillows, and Isabella found herself noting these small signs of care and attention to comfort. "The horses are Molly and Sam," Thomas said as he secured her suitcase in the wagon bed. "They're gentle as lambs, never given me a moment's trouble. Molly there has been with us for 8 years, practically part of the family." Isabella appreciated his efforts at conversation, even though she found herself unable to respond with more than nods and brief acknowledgments. The habit of silence had become so ingrained that speaking felt like lifting enormous weights, each word requiring conscious effort to produce. Thomas helped her up onto the wagon seat with the same careful courtesy he had shown throughout their meeting, making sure she was settled before taking up the reins. As they began the journey toward his ranch, Isabella found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in golden grass that moved like ocean waves in the constant wind. In the distance, mountains rose against a sky so vast and blue it seemed impossible, their peaks already touched with early snow. It was beautiful in a way that made Isabella's chest ache. Beautiful and empty and completely unlike anything she had ever experienced. "It takes some getting used to," Thomas said, apparently noticing her reaction to the landscape. "The space, I mean. Folks who come from back east sometimes find it overwhelming at first. But there's a peace to it once you settle in. A man can think out here, really think, without all the noise and commotion of city life." Isabella wondered what Thomas Mitchell thought about during his long hours in this vast silence, wondered what brought the occasional shadow she glimpsed, crossing his features when he thought she wasn't looking. His letters had been polite, but revealed little about his personal history beyond the basic facts. He was 31 years old, owned a cattle ranch inherited from his father, and lived alone except for his housekeeper after his parents' deaths from influenza 2 winters previous. "The ranch has been in my family for 12 years, Thomas continued, filling the comfortable silence with information Isabella sensed he hoped would help her feel more at ease. "My father came out here after the war, said he needed space to breathe after what he'd seen back east. Built the house himself, started with just 20 head of cattle and a lot of determination." "You didn't fight in the war?" Isabella asked, the question emerging before she could stop herself. "Too young," Thomas replied simply. "I was only 14 when it ended. Sometimes I think my father was grateful for that. Didn't want his son to see what he'd seen. He never talked much about those years, but I could tell they stayed with him." Isabella understood about experiences that stayed with a person, about memories that colored every day regardless of how much time passed. She found herself studying Thomas's profile as he drove, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his hands held the reins with confident gentleness. There was something solid about him, something that suggested the kind of reliability Isabella had almost forgotten existed in men. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they traveled deeper into the Montana wilderness, and Isabella found herself beginning to relax for the first time in months. The rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the vast quiet of the landscape combined to create a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since childhood. When Thomas pointed ahead to a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley between 2 gentle hills, Isabella felt her heart rate increase again. The ranch was larger than she had expected, with a substantial 2-story house, several outbuildings, and corrals that held what appeared to be dozens of horses and cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and Isabella could see warm light glowing in the windows. "Home," Thomas said simply, and something in his voice made Isabella look at him more closely. There was pride there, but also a loneliness that Isabella recognized from her own experience. This was a man who had built something meaningful but had no one to share it with, no one to appreciate the result of his years of hard work and careful planning. As they approached the house, a woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on an apron and beaming with what appeared to be genuine excitement. Sarah was perhaps 50 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and the sturdy build of someone accustomed to physical work. But it was her smile that caught Isabella's attention, warm and welcoming in a way that made Isabella's throat constrict with unexpected emotion. "Miss Martinez," Sarah called out as Thomas brought the wagon to a stop near the front porch. "Welcome, welcome. I've been so excited to meet you. Been cooking all day to make sure you have a proper welcome meal." Isabella climbed down from the wagon with Thomas's assistance, her legs unsteady after the long journey and the emotional weight of finally arriving at her destination. Sarah approached with the same careful respect for personal space that Thomas had shown, but her enthusiasm was unmistakable. "I hope you're hungry," Sarah continued, her eyes kind but sharp enough that Isabella suspected little escaped her notice. "I've made pot roast with all the fixings, fresh bread, and apple pie from the last of this season's apples. Thomas here has been living on beans and bacon for too long. Poor man needs someone to make sure he eats properly." "Sarah," Thomas protested mildly, but Isabella caught the affection in his voice, the easy familiarity of people who had become family through shared experience rather than blood. "Well, it's true," Sarah replied, unrepentant. "You work yourself, and too hard, and don't take proper care. Now Miss Martinez can help me make sure you remember to eat regular meals like a civilized person." Isabella found herself almost smiling at the exchange, charmed, despite her nervousness, by the easy warmth between Thomas and his housekeeper. It spoke of the kind of household where kindness was the norm rather than the exception, where people looked after each other as a matter of course. "Let me show you to your room," Sarah said, turning her attention back to Isabella. "You'll want to freshen up before dinner, and I imagine you're tired from all that traveling. Thomas, you bring her bag up, and don't you dare peek at any of her personal things." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied with mock solemnity, earning a swat from Sarah's dish towel. As Isabella followed Sarah into the house, she was struck by the immediate sense of warmth and care that permeated every detail. The front hall was spotless but lived in, with hooks for coats and a bench for removing boots. Family photographs lined a small table, and Isabella caught glimpses of people who shared Thomas's strong features and kind eyes. The house was larger, inside than it had appeared from outside, with a comfortable parlour, a substantial kitchen that smelled of baking bread and roasting meat, and a dining room set with what appeared to be the family's best china. Everything spoke of preparation, of someone taking care to make Isabella feel welcomed and valued. "Your room is up here," Sarah said, leading Isabella up a staircase that creaked pleasantly under their feet. "It's the nicest bedroom in the house, gets the morning sun, and has a lovely view of the eastern pastures. I've put fresh linens on the bed and made sure there are plenty of blankets. November nights can get mighty cold out here." The bedroom was indeed beautiful, with windows that looked out over rolling grassland, and a bed covered in a quilt that appeared to be handmade. There was a dresser with a mirror, a comfortable chair by the window, and a small table perfect for writing letters or reading. Most importantly, Isabella noticed, the door had a sturdy lock. "Thomas had me put that lock on special," Sarah said, noticing Isabella's attention to the door. "Figured a lady deserves privacy and security in her own room. Key's right there on." The dresser. Isabella felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. The lock wasn't just about privacy, it was about choice, about having control over her own safety. After 3 years of never feeling secure, the simple presence of that lock felt like an extraordinary gift. "I'll leave you to get settled," Sarah continued. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour. Take your time, make yourself at home. This is your house now too, and I want you to feel comfortable here." After Sarah left, closing the door quietly behind her, Isabella stood alone in her new room and tried to process the events of the day. Everything felt surreal, from the vast landscape, to Thomas's unexpected gentleness, to Sarah's immediate acceptance. After months of careful planning and fearful anticipation, she was finally here, finally safe, finally beginning whatever came next. Isabella moved to the window and looked out at the darkening landscape, watching the last light fade behind the distant mountains. Somewhere out there was the life she had fled, the memories she was trying to escape, the person she had been before fear and violence had changed everything. But here, in this room with its handmade quilt and sturdy lock, surrounded by people who seemed genuinely kind, Isabella began to wonder if it might be possible to become someone new. The smell of Sarah's cooking drifted up from the kitchen below, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and the clean mountain air flowing through the slightly open window. For the first time in 3 years, Isabella allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be truly safe, to go to sleep without listening for footsteps in the hall, to wake up without immediately assessing potential threats. She was still, standing by the window when Thomas's voice called softly from the hallway, "Miss Martinez, dinner's ready whenever you are. No rush, just wanted you to know." Isabella touched the key on the dresser, solid and real beneath her fingers, then straightened her shoulders and prepared to join Thomas and Sarah for her first meal in her new home. Outside, the Montana night was settling over the ranch with its vast silence and endless stars, and Isabella Martinez was about to discover that sometimes healing begins with the simple act of sitting down to dinner with people who ask nothing, more than the chance to show kindness to a stranger who has traveled far to find safety. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Isabella's first week at the Mitchell Ranch unfolded like the careful turning of delicate pages in a book she was afraid to read too quickly. Each morning brought new discoveries about the rhythms of ranch life, the personalities of the people who had welcomed her, and most surprisingly, about herself. The woman who had stepped off the train in Clearwater Junction was slowly beginning to emerge from the protective shell she had built around her heart. The mornings began before dawn, with the sound of Thomas moving quietly through the house, preparing for a day of work that started with feeding livestock and checking fences before most of the world had opened its eyes. Isabella, accustomed to sleepless nights and hypervigilance, found herself naturally waking at these early hours. From her bedroom window, she would watch Thomas cross the yard to the barn, his lantern creating a small circle of warm light in the pre-dawn darkness. There was something profoundly peaceful about these early morning observations. Thomas moved with the confident efficiency of a man who knew his work intimately, but Isabella noticed he also took time to greet each animal individually, scratching behind the ears of his favorite horse, checking on a cow that seemed to be favoring one leg, speaking in low, soothing tones that carried across the quiet air. These glimpses into his character, when he thought no one was watching, revealed a man of genuine compassion, someone who extended care even to creatures that couldn't thank him for it. Sarah proved to be a revelation in her own right. The housekeeper possessed an intuitive understanding of Isabella's need for space and gentle integration into household routines. Rather than overwhelming her new guest with expectations or forced conversation, Sarah created opportunities for Isabella to participate in daily activities at her own pace. On her second morning, Isabella found herself standing uncertainly in the kitchen doorway, unsure whether she should offer to help or remain out of the way. "Good morning, dear," Sarah said, without turning from the stove where she was preparing what appeared to be enough breakfast to feed a small army. "Sleep well. The mountain air takes some getting used to, but most folks find it helps them rest deeper once they adjust." "Yes, thank you," Isabella replied, still hovering in the doorway. The kitchen was warm and filled with the enticing aromas of bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits, but more than that, it radiated the kind of comfortable domesticity that Isabella had almost forgotten existed. "Would you like to help me set the table?" Sarah asked, her tone casual enough that Isabella wouldn't feel obligated, but warm enough to convey genuine welcome. "Thomas will be in soon, and the ranch hands eat breakfast here on Mondays and Fridays. Nothing fancy, just good food to start the day right." Isabella nodded and moved to help, grateful for something to do with her hands. As she arranged plates and silverware on the large dining table, she found herself listening to Sarah's gentle chatter about the ranch, the coming winter, and the personalities of the various men who worked for Thomas. "Jake Patterson's been with us for 5 years now," Sarah explained, as she transferred biscuits from pan to basket. "Good man, steady worker, but he's got a terrible sweet tooth. I swear he'd live on nothing but pie and candy if I let him. Then there's Miguel Santos, came up from Texas 2 years ago. Best horse trainer I've ever seen, can gentle even the wildest Mustang with nothing but patience and carrots." The ranch. Hands, when they arrived for breakfast, proved to be as different from each other as Sarah had suggested, but they shared a common thread of respectful courtesy toward Isabella that spoke well of Thomas's leadership. Jake Patterson was indeed a man with kind eyes and a slightly soft middle that suggested Sarah's cooking was much appreciated. Miguel Santos moved with the fluid grace of someone who spent his life working with horses, and when he removed his hat upon entering the house, Isabella saw he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 25, with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors year-round. "Ma'am," each man said simply as Sarah introduced Isabella, their greetings polite but not intrusive. She appreciated that neither pressed for conversation or personal information, accepting her quiet presence at the breakfast table without question or comment. Thomas presided over these meals with the easy authority of a man comfortable in his role as both employer and friend to his workers. Isabella watched the dynamics carefully, noting how he listened to their reports about the cattle, made decisions about the day's priorities, and showed genuine concern for their well-being. When Miguel mentioned that his mare was showing signs of lameness, Thomas immediately suggested bringing the veterinarian from town, despite the expense. "A good horse is worth the cost of proper care," Thomas said simply, and Isabella caught Miguel's grateful nod. It was clear that Thomas's employees respected him not just as their boss, but as a man who treated both animals and people with fairness and consideration. After the ranch hands departed for their daily work, Isabella found herself alone with Sarah in the kitchen, helping with the morning cleanup. These quiet domestic tasks felt both foreign and comforting after years of living in boarding houses and cramped apartments where she had been responsible only for her own minimal needs. "Thomas mentioned you might enjoy a tour of the property," Sarah said, as they washed and dried the breakfast dishes. "He's got some time after lunch if you're interested. Might help you get your bearings, see what all is here." The suggestion made Isabella's stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. The idea of being alone with Thomas, even for something as innocent as a tour of the ranch, triggered memories she worked hard to suppress. But she also recognized that avoiding all interaction with her new husband would be neither practical nor fair. She had come here to build a new life, and that required taking calculated risks. "That would be nice," Isabella managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's sharp eyes caught the tension in Isabella's response, and her expression softened with understanding. "Would you like me to come along? I could use the exercise, and there are some things about the property I'd like to check on anyway." The offer was made casually, but Isabella recognized it for what it was. A kindness designed to make her feel safer without drawing attention to her discomfort. She nodded gratefully, wondering how Sarah had developed such sensitivity to the needs of frightened women. The morning hours passed quietly, with Isabella helping Sarah with household tasks and gradually learning the routines that kept the ranch running smoothly. She discovered that Sarah was not only an excellent cook, but also served as the ranch's unofficial bookkeeper, maintaining careful records of expenses, cattle counts, and employee wages in a series of well-organized ledgers. "Thomas is good with the animals and the land," Sarah explained as she showed Isabella the accounting system, "but he's not much for paperwork. His father was the same way. They're both practical men who prefer to work with their hands rather than push pencils around." Isabella found herself drawn to the orderly columns of numbers and careful notations. In Chicago, Before her world had collapsed, she had worked as a bookkeeper for a small import business. The familiar patterns of accounting felt like rediscovering a forgotten language, and she found herself mentally organizing and improving Sarah's system without conscious thought. "You know something about bookkeeping," Sarah observed, watching Isabella's reactions to the ledgers. "A little," Isabella admitted. "I worked in an office before I came here." Sarah nodded without pressing for details, but Isabella caught a thoughtful expression crossing her face. The housekeeper was clearly a woman who understood that everyone had stories they weren't ready to tell, and she respected those boundaries while remaining open to whatever Isabella might choose to share. Lunch was a quieter affair, with just the three of them around the kitchen table. Thomas had come in from the morning's work with dirt under his fingernails and hay in his hair, but he had taken the time to wash thoroughly and change into a clean shirt before joining them. The courtesy was so automatic, Isabella suspected it was simply part of his character, rather than any special effort for her benefit. "Sarah tells me you'd like to see more of the ranch," Thomas said, as they finished eating. "I thought we might start with the main barn and work our way out to the pastures. The cattle are in the near fields right now, preparing for winter, so you can get a good look at the herd." "That sounds wonderful," Isabella replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Despite her nervousness about spending time alone with Thomas, she was genuinely curious about the operation he had built, the life he was offering to share with her. The afternoon tour revealed the impressive scope of the Mitchell Ranch. Thomas had inherited a good foundation from his father, but it was clear he had expanded and improved the operation significantly. The main barn was a substantial structure, housing not only the horses used for ranch work, but also several milk cows, a small flock of chickens, and Sarah's pride and joy, a vegetable garden that had been extended with a greenhouse to provide fresh produce through the winter months. Sarah designed the greenhouse herself, Thomas explained with obvious pride as they examined the structure. "Drew up the plans and supervised the construction. We can grow greens and herbs year-round now, even when there's 3 feet of snow on the ground." Sarah beamed at the recognition, and Isabella could see the deep mutual respect between the housekeeper and the rancher. They functioned as a team, each contributing their strengths to make the ranch successful and comfortable. The cattle were impressive as well, a mixed herd of perhaps 200 head, grazing peacefully in fields that stretched toward the distant mountains. Thomas explained the breeding program he was developing, his goal of improving the quality of his stock while maintaining the hardiness necessary for Montana winters. "The key is finding the right balance," he said, leaning against a fence post, while watching a group of calves play in the afternoon sunshine. "You want cattle that can survive harsh weather and sparse grazing, but you also want animals that will bring good prices at market. It's taken me 5 years to develop the bloodlines I want." Isabella found herself genuinely interested in the complexities of ranch management, asking questions about breeding cycles, feed requirements, and market conditions. Thomas answered thoroughly, clearly pleased to have someone show interest in his work. As they talked, Isabella began to understand that ranching required not just physical labor, but considerable business acumen and long-term planning. "The hardest part is the isolation," Thomas admitted as they walked back toward the house in the gathering dusk. "There are days when I don't see another soul except Sarah and the ranch hands. A man can get too much time alone with his thoughts. Out here?" Isabella understood about too much time alone with thoughts, about how silence could become a breeding ground for memories better left undisturbed. But she also saw something else in Thomas's admission: loneliness. He had built something impressive and meaningful, but he had no one to share it with, no one to appreciate the results of his hard work and careful planning. "It's beautiful," Isabella said softly, looking back at the ranch buildings nestled in the valley, warm light glowing from the windows against the approaching darkness. "You've built something wonderful here." Thomas stopped walking and looked at her directly for the first time that day, his expression serious but hopeful. "I'd like it to be wonderful for you too, Isabella. I know this isn't what you might have dreamed of when you were a girl, marrying a stranger and moving to the middle of nowhere. But I hope we can build something good together, even if it takes time." The use of her first name, spoken with such genuine warmth, made Isabella's throat constrict with unexpected emotion. In his voice, she heard none of the possessiveness or demand that had characterized her previous experience with men. Instead, there was respect, patience, and what sounded remarkably like hope. "I'd like that too," Isabella whispered, the words barely audible but carrying more truth than she had spoken in years. That evening, as Isabella prepared for bed in her comfortable room with its sturdy lock, she reflected on the day's revelations. The ranch was larger and more successful than she had anticipated. Thomas was proving to be a man of genuine character and kindness, and Sarah had become an unexpected source of comfort and practical wisdom. But perhaps most surprisingly, Isabella had caught herself genuinely smiling twice during the afternoon. Once, when Sarah had scolded a particularly stubborn rooster, and again, when Thomas had patiently explained something to a young calf that seemed determined to ignore his guidance. The smiles had felt rusty and unfamiliar, but they had been real. As she settled into bed, listening to the unfamiliar but somehow comforting sounds of the ranch at night, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses, the whisper of wind through the tall grass, Isabella allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might actually be safe here. Not just physically safe, though that was revolutionary enough, but emotionally safe, protected by people who seemed to understand that healing required patience, and that trust had to be earned through consistent kindness rather than demanded through force. Outside her window, the Montana night sky displayed more stars than Isabella had ever seen, a vast canopy of light that made her feel both infinitely small and somehow connected to something larger than her own pain. For the first time in 3 years, Isabella fell asleep without checking the lock on her door twice, without planning escape routes, without listening for threatening footsteps in the hall. She was beginning to understand that sometimes safety wasn't just about locked doors and defensive strategies. Sometimes it was about finding people who created space for healing, who offered kindness without expecting immediate gratitude, who understood that broken things needed time and patience to become whole again. In Thomas Mitchell and Sarah, Isabella was discovering what it meant to be treated with genuine respect and care. And slowly, carefully, she was beginning to remember who she had been before fear had stolen her ability to trust. The second week of November brought the first serious snowfall to the Mitchell Ranch, transforming the familiar landscape into something from a winter fairy tale. Isabella woke to find her bedroom window completely frosted over, delicate ice crystals creating intricate patterns that caught the early morning light like tiny diamonds. But as beautiful as the snow was, it also brought an unexpected challenge that would test the fragile trust she had begun to build. Thomas appeared at breakfast that morning with worry lines creasing his forehead and the tense posture of a man facing a crisis. "Cattle are scattered across the back 40, he announced to Jake and Miguel as they gathered around the kitchen table. "Storm drove them into the ravines looking for shelter. We need to get them rounded up and brought in before the weather gets worse." Isabella listened to the urgent discussion about search patterns and logistics, noting how quickly the atmosphere in the house had shifted from peaceful routine to controlled emergency. The men would be gone for most of the day, possibly longer if the cattle had wandered farther than expected. It was exactly the kind of situation that would have sent Isabella into panic just weeks ago. Being left alone, unable to predict when the men would return, vulnerable to unexpected visitors or circumstances. But as she helped Sarah pack provisions for the search party, Isabella realized something significant had changed. The anxiety was still there, a familiar knot in her stomach, but it wasn't the paralyzing terror that had once ruled her life. Instead, she found herself focused on practical concerns, making sure the men had enough food and hot coffee, helping Sarah plan meals that could be easily reheated whenever they returned. "You'll be all right here with me," Sarah said quietly as they worked together in the kitchen, her words carefully casual but clearly intended to offer reassurance. "I've been through plenty of these emergency roundups. Sometimes they're back by supper, sometimes not until the next morning. We'll keep ourselves busy and have hot food waiting whenever they walk through that door." After the men departed into the swirling snow, the house settled into an unusual quiet. Isabella had grown accustomed to the sounds of male voices and boots on the wooden floors, the sense of purposeful activity that characterized normal ranch operations. Now, with just herself and Sarah, the silence felt profound and somehow expectant. "Well then," Sarah said, rolling up her sleeves with the air of someone about to tackle a significant project, "seems like a perfect day to go through the winter clothes situation. Thomas mentioned you might need some warmer things, and I've got boxes of his mother's clothing stored upstairs. She was about your size, and there's no sense in good wool going to waste." The suggestion triggered an immediate emotional response that Isabella struggled to hide. Accepting charity, wearing dead women's clothes, being dependent on others for basic needs, all of it reminded her of the desperate circumstances that had brought her to Montana. But underneath the shame and resistance, Isabella recognized the genuine kindness in Sarah's offer and the practical necessity of warm clothing for mountain winters. They spent the morning in the attic room, where Mrs. Mitchell's belongings had been carefully preserved. Sarah moved through the boxes with reverent care, sharing memories of the woman who had been both employer and friend for so many years. "Helen Mitchell was the strongest woman I ever knew," Sarah said, holding up a beautifully tailored wool coat in deep blue. "Came out here as a young bride, just like you, and built this place alongside her husband through sheer determination. And Grace, she could deliver a calf, negotiate with cattle buyers, and serve dinner for 20 people without breaking a sweat." Isabella fingered the fabric of the coat, noting the quality of the material and the skilled construction. These were clothes that had belonged to a woman of substance, someone who had found her place in this harsh landscape and thrived. As she tried on various garments, Isabella found herself wondering what Helen Mitchell's story had been, what challenges she had faced, what strengths she had discovered in herself. "This looks perfect on you," Sarah said, stepping back to assess how Isabella looked in a practical riding skirt and fitted jacket. Helen would be pleased to see her clothes being worn by someone who needs them. She never could stand to see good things go to waste. But it was while sorting through a trunk of more personal items that Isabella made a discovery that would change her understanding of the Mitchell family forever. Hidden beneath carefully folded linens was a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, and something about Sarah's sudden stillness when she saw them suggested their significance. "What are those?" Isabella asked, noting how Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the bundle. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her response carefully. "Letters from Helen to her sister back in Ohio," she said finally. "Written during her first year here, when she was adjusting to ranch life." There was something in Sarah's tone that suggested more story behind those carefully chosen words. Isabella waited, sensing that whatever Sarah was debating whether to share might be important for her own situation. "Helen had a difficult first marriage," Sarah said finally, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Back in Ohio, before she came west, her first husband was, well, he was not a good man. She came here carrying scars just like you, The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Sarah's knowing look, her immediate understanding of Isabella's need for locks and safety, her intuitive grasp of what frightened women required, it all made sense now. Helen Mitchell had been running from something too, seeking safety in the vast anonymity of the frontier. "She told you about me," Isabella said, not quite a question. "Thomas told me enough," Sarah replied gently. "Not details, mind you, just that you'd had some troubles back east and needed a fresh start. But I've seen that look before, dear. The way you check for exits, how you hold yourself ready to run. Helen had that same wariness when she first arrived." Isabella sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that her story wasn't unique, that other women had fled to this same place, seeking the same thing she was looking for. Did it get better for her? Sarah's face softened with memory and affection. "Oh, my dear, yes. It took time, of course. Helen was jumpy as a cat for the first 6 months, startled by every unexpected sound. But Thomas's father was patient with her, gentle in the same way Thomas is with you. Gradually, she began to trust that she was truly safe here, that she could build whatever kind of life she wanted." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. The house, though it was far too early for Thomas and the others to return from their cattle search. Isabella's body immediately tensed, old instincts flooding back as she moved to the window to assess the potential threat. What she saw made her stomach drop with familiar dread. 3 men on horseback were approaching the house, none of them familiar, all of them carrying themselves with the kind of aggressive confidence that Isabella had learned to fear. They weren't dressed like ranch hands or local businessmen, and something about their purposeful approach toward the house suggested they weren't here for any legitimate business. "Sarah," Isabella called softly, her voice tight with the old terror. "There are men coming. I don't think they're friends." Sarah joined her at the window, her expression growing serious as she assessed the approaching riders. "I don't recognize them," she said grimly, "and honest men don't usually ride up to isolated ranches when they know the men are away." Isabella's mind was already calculating escape routes and defensive strategies, the survival skills that had kept her alive in Chicago, flooding back with devastating clarity. But Sarah's reaction surprised her. Instead of panic or helplessness, the older woman moved with swift efficiency to a cabinet near the fireplace and withdrew a rifle that Isabella hadn't known was there. "Can you shoot?" Sarah asked matter-of-factly, checking the rifle's ammunition with practiced hands. "Yes," Isabella replied automatically, muscle memory from her father's hunting lessons surfacing despite years of disuse. "Good. There's another rifle in Thomas's study, loaded and ready. These men might be looking for easy pickings, thinking they can intimidate 2 women alone. They're about to discover they've made a serious mistake." The transformation in Sarah was remarkable. Gone was the gentle housekeeper who worried about proper meals and comfortable quilts. In her place stood a frontier woman who had clearly faced threats before and survived them. Isabella found herself drawing strength from Sarah's calm competence, her matter-of-fact approach to danger. The men dismounted near the front porch, and Isabella could hear their voices through the walls, rough and demanding. They were discussing the best approach, debating whether anyone was home, making crude jokes about what they might find inside. Their words confirmed Isabella's worst fears about their intentions. "Ladies!" one of them called out, his voice carrying false friendliness that fooled no one. "We know you're in there. Just want to talk. Maybe get some food and shelter from this storm. No need to be unfriendly about it." Sarah positioned herself at a front window where she could see the porch clearly, rifle ready but not yet visible. To the men outside, she gestured for Isabella to take a position at a side window that would give them crossfire coverage of the yard. "You men need to move along," Sarah called back, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." The response was immediate and predictable. Laughter, crude comments about what two women could do to stop them, and the sound of boots on the porch steps. Isabella's heart was racing, but alongside the familiar terror was something new: anger. These men thought they could intimidate and threaten innocent women, simply because they were isolated and seemingly defenseless. They were about to learn otherwise. When the first man reached for the front door handle, Sarah's rifle appeared in the window with the swift precision of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "I said you're not welcome here," Sarah repeated, her voice deadly calm. "And I meant it. You've got about 10 seconds to get back on your horses and ride out of here before this conversation gets unpleasant." The men froze, clearly not having expected armed resistance from women they had assumed would be easy targets. Isabella saw them exchanging glances, calculating whether two women would actually have the nerve to shoot, whether they could rush the house before the rifles could be effectively used. "Now you listen here, lady," the apparent leader began, his voice turning ugly with thwarted entitlement. "We've been riding all day in this weather, and we're going to get warm and fed whether you like it or not. You can make this easy or hard." But either way, Sarah's rifle cracked across his words, the bullet striking the porch railing inches from his hand. The sound was deafening in the winter air, and the message was unmistakable. "That was your warning shot," Sarah announced conversationally. "The next one won't miss. Isabella, you see that bay horse on the left? Put a bullet near its feet if any of these gentlemen make another move toward this house." Isabella's rifle appeared in the side window, and she was surprised by how steady her hands were, how naturally the weapon settled into familiar position. The terror was still there, but it was controlled now, channeled into determined resistance rather than paralyzing helplessness. The men had clearly not expected this level of organized defense. They began backing away from the house, hands raised in surrender, voices filled with protests about their peaceful intentions. But Isabella could see the calculation in their eyes, the way they were assessing angles and distances, planning their next move. "You ladies are making a big mistake," the leader called out as they retreated toward their horses. "We'll remember this ranch, remember your faces, might come back when your men aren't around to protect you." "Our men are due back any minute," Sarah replied evenly, though Isabella knew that might not be true. "And when they arrive, I'll be sure to tell them about your visit and your threats. Thomas Mitchell has friends throughout this territory, and threatening his family is the kind of thing that tends to follow a man wherever he goes." The mention of Thomas's name seemed to give the men pause. Even Isabella, new to the territory, had heard enough conversations to understand that the Mitchell name carried weight in local circles. The men mounted their horses with obvious reluctance, but they did mount and begin moving away from the house. Isabella kept her rifle trained on the departing riders until they disappeared over the first hill, her body still tense with adrenaline and the aftermath of confrontation. Only when Sarah lowered her own weapon did Isabella allow herself to breathe normally again. "Well," Sarah said, checking to make sure her rifle was safely unloaded, "that was invigorating. Nothing like a little excitement to break up a quiet afternoon." Isabella stared at the older woman in amazement. "How can you be so calm? They could have, but didn't," Sarah interrupted gently. "You handled yourself well, dear. Stood your ground, kept your nerve, showed them that Mitchell women aren't easy prey. Helen would have been proud of you." The words, Mitchell women, resonated in Isabella's chest with unexpected power. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she had been part of something, had defended something that belonged to her. The ranch, Sarah, the life they were building, all of it had been worth protecting, worth fighting for. "Do you think they'll come back?" Isabella asked, still watching the horizon where the men had disappeared. "Not likely," Sarah replied confidently. "Men like that are bullies, looking for easy targets. We proved we're not easy, and word will get around." Besides, Thomas and the boys will be back soon, and I guarantee they'll want to track down those riders and have a conversation about appropriate behavior toward ladies." As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses approaching again made both women tense. But this time, the riders were familiar. Thomas, Jake, and Miguel returning from their cattle drive, their faces red with cold, but their posture suggesting successful completion of their mission. Isabella watched Thomas's expression change as Sarah recounted the afternoon's events, saw his jaw tighten with controlled anger at the thought of threats to his household. But when he looked at Isabella, his eyes held something she hadn't expected: pride. "Sarah says you handled yourself like a veteran," he said quietly, his voice carrying respect and admiration. "I'm grateful you were here to help protect what's ours." What's ours? The words settled into Isabella's heart like seeds in fertile ground, promising future growth she was only beginning to imagine. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Isabella felt not just safe, but strong. Not just protected, but capable of protecting others. She was becoming a Mitchell woman, and that meant something important in this vast, challenging, beautiful territory. That night, as snow continued to fall outside her window, Isabella reflected on the day's revelations and challenges. She had learned about Helen Mitchell's hidden history, discovered her own capacity for courage under pressure, and most importantly, began to understand that healing didn't just mean recovering from past trauma. It meant building the strength to face future challenges with confidence and dignity. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Clearwater Junction was still part of her, but she was no longer the only part. Isabella Martinez was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who belonged to this place and these people in ways that went deeper than marriage contracts or legal arrangements. She was coming home. The confrontation with the threatening strangers had awakened something profound in Isabella, but it had also stirred memories she had worked desperately to bury. 3 days after the incident, she found herself struggling with vivid nightmares that merged her past trauma with recent events, creating a confused tangle of fear and anger that left her exhausted and emotionally raw. Thomas noticed the change. Immediately, Isabella had begun to withdraw again, speaking only when spoken to, jumping at unexpected sounds and avoiding eye contact during meals. The progress she had made over her first weeks at the ranch seemed to be evaporating, replaced by the hyper-vigilant wariness that had characterized her arrival. On the 4th morning after the confrontation, Thomas made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their relationship. Instead of respecting Isabella's obvious desire for distance, he knocked gently on her bedroom door and asked if she would join him for a ride to check the fence lines in the eastern pasture. "I could use the company," he said through the door, his voice carefully casual, "and I think you might benefit from getting away from the house for a while. Sometimes when my thoughts get too tangled up, the only thing that helps is wide-open spaces and horse therapy." Isabella's first instinct was to decline, to retreat further into the safety of isolation. But something in Thomas's tone, a vulnerability she hadn't heard before, made her reconsider. He wasn't demanding her presence or insisting on conversation. He was offering companionship to someone who might need it, while admitting his own occasional need for the same thing. An hour later, Isabella found herself mounted on a gentle mare named Buttercup, following Thomas across snow-covered pastures toward the distant fence line. The Montana landscape was breathtaking in its winter dress, endless white, broken only by the dark lines of fence posts and the occasional cluster of cattle seeking shelter near stands of pine trees. They rode in comfortable silence for the first half-hour, the only sounds the crunch of snow under their horses' hooves and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Isabella gradually felt some of her tension begin to ease, as the rhythm of riding and the vastness of the landscape worked their calming magic on her overwrought nerves. "My father used to say that horses could sense a person's true nature," Thomas said eventually, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Said that's why Buttercup took to you so quickly. She's usually skittish around new people, but she seemed to know you were someone worth trusting." Isabella looked down at the mare's neck, noting how the animal moved with calm confidence beneath her. It was true that Buttercup had been unusually cooperative during their few previous interactions, as if she sensed Isabella's need for gentle treatment. "She's a good horse," Isabella replied, her first words of the day. "She's a survivor," Thomas said, and something in his tone made Isabella look at him more closely. "Found her 3 years ago, wandering alone in the mountains. Someone had beaten her badly, left her to die. Took months to gain her trust, longer still to convince her that not all humans would hurt her." The parallel was unmistakable, and Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks at Thomas's indirect reference to her own situation. But when she studied his profile, she saw no judgment or manipulation in his expression, only genuine care for both the horse and the woman riding her. They reached the fence line and dismounted to examine a section that had been damaged by falling branches during the recent storm. As Thomas worked to repair the break, Isabella found herself studying his movements, the competent way he handled tools and materials, the care he took to ensure the repair would hold through winter weather. "Thomas," Isabella said suddenly, the words emerging before she could stop them, "why did you really answer my letter? Why did you want a mail-order bride?" Thomas paused in his work, considering his response carefully. "Loneliness, mostly," he said finally. "This is a good life, but it's a solitary one. I wanted someone to share it with, someone to build something meaningful alongside. My parents had that kind of partnership, where they were stronger together than either could be alone. But you could have found someone locally, someone you could court properly. Why take a chance on a stranger?" Thomas set down his tools and turned to face her directly, his expression serious but not uncomfortable. "Because local courtship requires a certain kind of performance, a pretense that everything is perfect and uncomplicated. I wanted honesty instead of performance, someone who was choosing this life deliberately rather than settling for it by default." Isabella absorbed this, recognizing the wisdom in his reasoning. Traditional courtship did involve elaborate deceptions, with both parties presenting idealized versions of themselves rather than their authentic realities. "And," Thomas continued, his voice growing quieter, "I suspected that any woman willing to travel across the country to marry a stranger might have her own reasons for needing a fresh start. I thought maybe we could help each other heal from whatever had brought us to that point." The words hung in the cold air between them, an invitation to honesty that Isabella felt both drawn to and terrified by. Part of her wanted to tell Thomas everything, to share the burden of her secrets with someone who seemed genuinely capable of handling them with care. But the larger part remained paralyzed by years of learning that vulnerability was dangerous, that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'm not who you think I am," Isabella said finally, her voice barely above. A whisper. "None of us are," Thomas replied gently. "We're all more complicated than we appear on the surface. The question isn't whether you're perfect, Isabella. The question is whether you're willing to let me know the real you, whatever that might mean." Before Isabella could respond, the sound of horses approaching made them both turn toward the main ranch. Jake Patterson was riding hard across the snow, his urgency unmistakable even from a distance. Thomas immediately began gathering his tools, his body language shifting to alert readiness. "Boss!" Jake called as he pulled his horse to a stop near the fence line. "We got trouble in town. Sheriff wants to see you immediately." "Something about those men who bothered the ladies the other day." Thomas's expression darkened. What kind of trouble? They hit the Wilson place yesterday while Jim was away, Jake explained, his face grim. Ransacked the house, threatened Mrs. Wilson and her daughters. Sheriff's organizing a posse to track them down, and he specifically asked for you. Isabella felt ice form in her stomach that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. The men who had threatened the ranch had escalated their behavior, moving from intimidation to actual violence. Worse, they were targeting isolated women exactly, the kind of predatory behavior that had driven Isabella from Chicago. "How long will you be gone?" Isabella asked, hating the tremor she heard in her own voice. Thomas studied her face, clearly reading the fear in her expression. "I don't know. Could be a few days, maybe longer if the trail leads out of the territory." The thought of Thomas leaving, of losing the security his presence provided, sent Isabella spiraling back toward the panic that had characterized her early days at the ranch. But underneath the fear was something else. Guilt. Other women were suffering because of men who had been emboldened by their successful intimidation at other isolated homesteads. If she had been braver, stronger, more willing to pursue justice, perhaps the Wilson family wouldn't have become victims. "It's not your fault," Thomas said quietly, apparently reading her thoughts with unsettling accuracy. "These men were always going to escalate. That's what men like them do. But now they've crossed a line that the community won't tolerate." The ride back to the ranch was tense, filled with urgent preparations for Thomas's departure with the posse. Sarah immediately began packing provisions while Jake and Miguel prepared horses and weapons. The atmosphere of the house transformed from peaceful domesticity to controlled military efficiency, and Isabella found herself both impressed by the smooth operation and terrified by its necessity. "I want you to have this," Thomas said privately to Isabella as he prepared to leave. He handed her a small Derringer pistol, its pearl handle gleaming in the lamplight. "It was my mother's. She carried it everywhere during her first years here, until she felt confident in her safety." Isabella accepted the weapon with hands that trembled slightly. The pistol was beautifully crafted but deadly serious, a reminder that frontier life required constant vigilance and the willingness to defend oneself when necessary. "I don't want to leave you," Thomas said, his voice carrying an intensity that surprised Isabella. "But I can't let these men continue terrorizing innocent families. They need to understand that there are consequences for preying on the vulnerable." "I understand," Isabella replied. And she did. Thomas's sense of responsibility extended beyond his own property to the entire community, a kind of leadership that required personal sacrifice for the greater good. But as Isabella watched Thomas ride away with the posse, disappearing into the swirling snow that had begun falling again, she realized that his absence would force her to confront truths about herself and her situation that she had been avoiding. Without Thomas's steady presence, without the daily routine of ranch life to distract her, Isabella would have to face the memories and fears that still ruled her life. That evening, as she sat with Sarah in the quiet parlor, Isabella made a decision that surprised both of them. "I want to tell you about Chicago," Isabella said suddenly, her words cutting through the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "About why I really came here, about what I'm running from." Sarah set down her mending and gave Isabella her full attention, her expression patient and non-judgmental. "Only if you want to, dear. Only if you think it will help." Isabella took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice halting at first, but growing stronger as she continued. She told Sarah about her life in Chicago, about the job she had loved and lost, about the man who had seemed charming and attentive until he had revealed his true nature. She described the escalating control, the threats, the violence that had made normal life impossible. His name was Vincent Castellano, Isabella said, the words feeling strange and dangerous in her mouth. He was wealthy, connected, powerful enough that no one would listen when I tried to tell them what he was doing. He said he owned me, that I would never be free of him no matter where I went. Sarah listened without interruption, her face reflecting understanding rather than shock or judgment. When Isabella finished her story, Sarah reached over and took her hands in a gesture of pure maternal comfort. "He lied to you," Sarah said firmly. "Men like that always lie. They want you to believe they're all-powerful, that escape is impossible, because your despair feeds their sense of control. But you did escape, Isabella. You're here, you're safe, and you're building a new life, despite everything he did to break your spirit." "But what if he finds me?" Isabella whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her since the day she fled Chicago. "What if he comes here, threatens Thomas and you the way he threatened everyone in Chicago?" "Then we'll deal with him," Sarah replied with the same matter-of-fact confidence she had shown when facing the threatening strangers. "This isn't Chicago, dear. This is Montana, where men like Vincent Castellano have no power, no connections, no ability to intimidate local law enforcement. Out here, a man's worth is measured by his character and his actions, not by his bank account or his family name." Isabella wanted to believe Sarah's words, wanted to accept that geography could provide the protection that law enforcement and social institutions had failed to offer. But years of living in fear had taught her that dangerous men found ways to extend their reach, to pursue their obsessions regardless of distance or obstacles. "Besides," Sarah continued with a slight smile, "any man fool enough to threaten a Mitchell woman would quickly discover that this community protects its own. Thomas has friends throughout the territory, men who believe in justice and aren't intimidated by city bullies with more money than sense." As they prepared for bed that night, Isabella realized that telling Sarah her story had lifted a weight she hadn't fully recognized she was carrying. The secrets that had felt so dangerous to keep hidden had lost some of their power once spoken aloud to someone who responded with understanding rather than judgment. But more importantly, Isabella was beginning to understand that her healing process wasn't just about recovering from past trauma. It was about claiming the right to build a future free from the shadows of what Vincent Castellano had done to her. She was learning that strength wasn't just about surviving abuse, but about refusing to let that abuse define the boundaries of what was possible. Outside, the Montana wind howled around the ranch house, carrying snow and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. But inside, warmed by the fire and by Sarah's steadfast support, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that she might be strong enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Whether they came from the unforgiving frontier landscape or from the haunting memories of a past she was finally ready to leave behind. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Clearwater Junction was still part of her story, but she was no longer the end of it. Isabella Martinez was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone worthy of the Mitchell name and everything it represented in this vast, challenging, beautiful territory. And for the first time since fleeing Chicago, she was beginning to believe that her future might be brighter than her past. Thomas had been gone for 6 days when the letter arrived, delivered by a traveling merchant who made regular runs between the major towns along the railroad line. Isabella was helping Sarah preserve the last of the autumn apples when the merchant knocked on the kitchen door, his weathered face apologetic as he handed over the envelope that would shatter the fragile peace Isabella had begun to build. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Isabella Martinez Mitchell, in handwriting that made Isabella's blood turn to ice in her veins. She recognized that precise, controlled script immediately. Vincent Castellano had found her. "Who's it from, dear?" Sarah asked, noting how Isabella's hands trembled as she stared at the envelope without opening it. "Him," Isabella whispered, the single word carrying the weight of all her fears. Vincent found me. Sarah immediately set down her paring knife and moved to Isabella's side, her presence solid and reassuring, despite the threat the letter represented. "You don't have to read it," Sarah said firmly. "We can burn it right now, pretend it never arrived." But Isabella knew that ignoring Vincent's communication wouldn't make him disappear. If anything, his silence might indicate he was already on his way to Montana, armed with whatever twisted logic had driven him to track her across a continent. With hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the paper, Isabella opened the envelope and began to read. "My dearest Isabella, did you really think you could disappear from me so easily? Did you imagine that a few train tickets and some clever deception would be enough to break the bond between us? I must admit, you led me on quite an entertaining chase across this vast country, but all games must eventually come to an end. I know where you are now, my dear. I know about your pathetic attempt at a new life, your sham marriage to some frontier nobody who thinks he can protect you from me. How amusing that you've traded the refinement and culture I offered you for the crude company of ranch hands and cattle. But perhaps this rustic phase will help you appreciate what you threw away when you fled Chicago. I arrive in Montana Territory on December 15th. You have until then to end this childish rebellion and return to where you belong. Come back to Chicago willingly, and I might find it in my heart to forgive this embarrassing episode. Force me to come collect you personally, and I promise you'll regret the inconvenience you've caused me. Your devoted protector, Vincent P.S. I hope your new husband understands that interfering with my property would be most unwise. I have resources he cannot imagine, and patience he should not test." Isabella's hands were shaking so violently by the time she finished reading that she dropped the letter, watching it flutter to the kitchen floor like a poisonous snowflake. December 15th was only 9 days away. Vincent wasn't making empty threats. He was already on his way. "What does he say?" Sarah asked, though Isabella's reaction had already told her everything she needed to know about the letter's contents. Isabella couldn't speak, couldn't find words to express the terror that was flooding through her nervous system. All the progress she had made, all the strength she had discovered, all the hope she had begun to nurture. Vincent's letter threatened to destroy it all with just a few carefully chosen words designed to remind her of her helplessness. Sarah picked up the letter and read it quickly, her expression growing progressively darker with each line. When she finished, she folded the paper with deliberate care and walked directly to the kitchen stove, where she opened the firebox and fed Vincent's words to the flames. "Well," Sarah said with grim satisfaction as she watched the letter burn, "he certainly has a high opinion of himself, doesn't he? Resources he cannot imagine. What nonsense. This is Montana Territory, not some Chicago drawing room where money can buy silence and compliance." Isabella stared at Sarah in amazement. Even faced with explicit threats from a man who had proven his willingness to use violence and intimidation, Sarah remained completely unimpressed by Vincent's attempt to project power and control. "You don't understand," Isabella said desperately. "Vincent isn't just making threats. In Chicago, he has judges in his pocket, police officers who look the other way, business partners who owe him favors. He destroyed 3 men who tried to help me, ruined their businesses and their reputations, with nothing more than a few strategic conversations. This isn't Chicago," Sarah replied calmly, pouring hot water for tea as if discussing train schedules rather than death threats. "Out here, a man's power comes from his character and his actions, not from his bank account or his political connections. Vincent Castellano might be a big fish in a small pond back east, but in Montana, he's just another city fool who doesn't understand how things work." Despite Sarah's confidence, Isabella could feel panic taking hold of her rational mind. "Vincent, had always been methodical in his pursuit of what he considered his property, and he had never failed to follow through on his threats. The thought of him bringing his twisted obsession to this place that had become her sanctuary filled Isabella with a terror that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "I have to leave," Isabella said suddenly, pacing to the window as if Vincent might already be visible on the horizon. "I have to go before he gets here. I won't let him hurt Thomas or you because of me." "Absolutely not," Sarah said with the firm authority of someone who had settled the matter completely. "Running didn't solve your problem the first time, and it won't solve it now. All it will do is prove to Vincent that his tactics work, that he can control you from a distance with nothing more than letters and threats. But if I stay, he'll come here. He'll bring whatever violence is necessary to take me back, and innocent people will get hurt trying to protect me." Sarah set down her teacup with a decisive clink and fixed Isabella with a stare that brooked no argument. "Listen to me very carefully, Isabella Martinez Mitchell. You are not some helpless victim anymore. You are a Mitchell woman, which means you belong to this family and this community. When someone threatens a Mitchell woman, they threaten all of us, and that is not something we tolerate quietly." The use of her married name, spoken with such fierce conviction, made Isabella pause in her frantic pacing. Sarah was right that she wasn't the same terrified woman who had fled Chicago. She had learned to defend herself and others, had found her voice and her strength, had begun to build a life worth protecting. "Besides," Sarah continued, "Thomas should be back with the posse any day now. When he hears about this letter, about Vincent's threats, he'll know exactly what needs to be done. Men like your former tormentor depend on fear and isolation to maintain their power. Take away those advantages, and they're just bullies who've never faced real consequences for their behavior." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the ranch, and Isabella's first terrified thought was that Vincent had somehow arrived ahead of schedule. But when she looked out the window, she saw Thomas and Miguel riding hard toward the house, their faces grim, but their posture suggesting urgency rather than defeat. Thomas was off his horse and through the kitchen door before Isabella could fully process his return, his eyes immediately finding hers with the instinctive concern that had become characteristic of their relationship. "We caught them," he said without preamble, "but not before they hit 2 more homesteads. When we finally cornered them near the territorial border, they started talking about being hired for specific jobs, paid to target particular ranches." Isabella felt her stomach drop as the implications of Thomas's words became clear. The men, who had been terrorizing isolated families, weren't just random criminals seeking easy targets. They were working for someone with specific objectives and sufficient resources to hire professional intimidation. They were asking questions about "you," Thomas continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Wanted to know about the new woman at the Mitchell Ranch, whether she matched a particular description they'd been given." Sarah wordlessly handed Thomas the ashes of Vincent's letter, now just blackened fragments in the firebox, and explained about the morning's delivery. Thomas listened with growing fury as Sarah recounted Vincent's threats and his promise to arrive within days. "He's been planning this for months," Thomas said grimly. "Hiring local criminals to scout the area, probably gathering information about our routines, our defenses, our connections. This isn't some impulsive pursuit, it's a calculated campaign." Isabella found herself simultaneously terrified by the evidence of Vincent's methodical approach and amazed by Thomas's immediate, tactical assessment of the situation. Rather than being intimidated by threats from a wealthy Chicago businessman, Thomas was already thinking strategically about how to counter Vincent's advantages. "What do we do?" Isabella asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "We prepare," Thomas replied simply, Miguel, I want you to ride to town and send telegrams to Sheriff Watson in Billings and Marshal Henderson in Helena. Tell them we have a situation developing that may require territorial law enforcement assistance. Also, send word to my brother-in-law in Butte. He has connections with federal marshals who specialize in interstate criminal pursuit. Miguel nodded and headed for the door, but Thomas stopped him with an additional instruction. And, Miguel, stop by the Collins Ranch, the Wilson Place, and the Davis Homestead. Tell them we may have visitors who aren't welcome, and ask them to keep their eyes open for strangers asking questions. As Miguel rode away on his urgent mission, Thomas turned, his attention back to Isabella with an expression that combined determination with genuine affection. "I want you to understand something," he said, taking her hands in his own weathered ones. "What's happening here isn't about you being a burden or bringing trouble to innocent people. This is about a criminal who thinks he can extend his reach into our territory, threaten our family, and intimidate our community. That makes it our fight, not just yours." "But Vincent is dangerous," Isabella protested. "He's not just some local bully you can frighten away with community solidarity. He has money, resources, connections, and we have something he doesn't," Thomas interrupted. "We have the law on our side, a community that protects its own, and the advantage of fighting on our own ground according to our own rules. Vincent Castellano might be accustomed to buying his way out of consequences back in Chicago, but out here, justice works differently." Sarah busied herself preparing a substantial meal while Thomas and Isabella continued planning their response to Vincent's threatened arrival. Isabella found herself drawing strength from their calm competence, their matter-of-fact approach to what felt like an overwhelming crisis. "There's something else you need to know," Thomas said as they sat down to eat. "When we questioned those hired men, they mentioned that their employer had promised them a substantial bonus if they could confirm certain details about your appearance and daily routine. Vincent wasn't just looking for you, he was studying you, learning your habits, planning his approach." The thought of being watched and studied from a distance made Isabella's skin crawl, but it also sparked anger that surprised her with its intensity. Vincent's obsessive need to control and possess had driven him to violate not just her privacy, but the safety of her entire adopted community. "I'm tired of running," Isabella said suddenly, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of being afraid of shadows, tired of letting Vincent Castellano determine how I live my life." Thomas smiled at her declaration, the expression transforming his serious features with warmth and pride. "Good, because running was never going to solve this problem permanently. Vincent needed to believe he could pursue you indefinitely, that geography was no barrier to his obsession. It's time he learned otherwise." That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last peaceful night before Vincent's arrival, Isabella realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her situation. She was no longer just a victim seeking sanctuary. She was a woman worth fighting for, surrounded by people willing to risk themselves for her safety and freedom. The frightened refugee who had arrived in Clearwater Junction had evolved into someone who belonged to this place and these people in ways that went deeper than legal documents or social conventions. She was Isabella Mitchell now, and that name carried weight and meaning in this territory. Vincent Castellano was about to discover that the woman he thought he owned had found something more powerful than his money or connections. She had found home, family, and the kind of love that transforms ordinary people into fierce protectors of what matters most. The battle for Isabella's freedom was about to begin, but this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. This time she would be fighting not just to escape her past, but to claim her future, and this time she intended to win. December 14th dawned with an unnatural stillness that seemed to press down on the Mitchell Ranch like a heavy blanket. The air held the metallic taste of approaching snow, and even the cattle seemed restless, clustering together in the lower pastures as if sensing the tension that had gripped the human inhabitants of the valley. Isabella woke before dawn, her body refusing to grant her the luxury of sleep when Vincent's promised arrival was less than 24 hours away. She dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Thomas already seated at the table, cleaning his rifle with the methodical precision of a man preparing for war. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without looking up from his work, though Isabella caught the slight smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Too much to think about," Isabella replied, settling into the chair across from him. Over the past week, as they had prepared for Vincent's arrival, she and Thomas had developed an easy intimacy born of shared purpose and mutual respect. The formal distance that had characterized their early interactions had evolved into something deeper and more authentic. "The territorial marshal arrived last night," Thomas said, setting down his cleaning rod and meeting Isabella's eyes directly. "Cameron Hughes, good man, solid reputation. He brought 2 deputies with him, and Sheriff Watson should be here by noon with additional support from Billings." Isabella nodded, trying to draw comfort from the presence of law enforcement backup. But she had learned not to place too much faith in official protection when it came to Vincent's particular brand of obsessive pursuit. "Thomas," she said hesitantly, "what if Vincent doesn't come alone? What if he's brought his own men, his own resources? In Chicago, he always had people willing to do his dirty work for him." Thomas finished reassembling his rifle and set it aside, giving Isabella his full attention. "Then we'll deal with whatever he brings. But remember, Isabella, this isn't Chicago. Out here, Vincent has no political connections, no bought judges, no network of corrupt officials to protect him. He's just another criminal threatening innocent people, and that makes him our problem to solve." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's arrival in the kitchen, her arms full of supplies for what promised to be a long and difficult day. Despite the gravity of their situation, Sarah moved with her usual brisk efficiency, preparing coffee and breakfast as if this were any other morning. "The Collinses sent word that they spotted riders yesterday evening," Sarah reported as she worked. 3 men heading toward town from the eastern approach, well-dressed and riding expensive horses. Could be your Vincent and his associates making their final approach." Isabella felt her stomach tighten at the news. But alongside the familiar fear was something new, a cold determination that surprised her with its intensity. Vincent had terrorized her for years, stolen her peace of mind, forced her to abandon everything familiar and flee across a continent. But he had also led her to this place, these people, this life that had proven more meaningful and authentic than anything she had known in Chicago. "I want to be armed today," Isabella said suddenly, her voice carrying a conviction that made both Thomas and Sarah look at her with approval. "Already taken care of," Thomas replied, producing the pearl-handled derringer he had given her weeks earlier, along with a gun belt that would allow her to carry it concealed but accessible. "Sarah's been practicing with her rifle every morning since we got Vincent's letter. We're as ready as we can be." The morning passed with tense efficiency as final preparations were completed. Marshal Hughes and his deputies positioned themselves strategically around the ranch, using the natural terrain to create overlapping fields of observation and fire. The neighboring ranches had sent men to help with the watch, creating a network of friendly eyes that would make it impossible for Vincent to approach undetected. But perhaps most importantly, word had spread throughout the community about the situation developing at the Mitchell Ranch. The general store in Clearwater Junction had refused to sell supplies to the 3 well-dressed strangers who had inquired about directions to the ranch. The local hotel had somehow experienced a mysterious shortage of available rooms, The blacksmith had been unable to shoe their horses due to an unexpected shortage of nails. Vincent's discovering that money doesn't buy cooperation when a community decides to protect its own, Marshal Hughes explained to Isabella as they reviewed the defensive arrangements. His type depends on intimidation and corruption to get what they want. Take away those advantages, and they're just bullies who've never learned to handle real resistance. As afternoon approached, a scout rode in with news that made everyone's pulse quicken. 3 riders were approaching the ranch from the main road, moving with the deliberate pace of men who believed they held all the advantages. Isabella positioned herself at the front window of the house, her derringer ready but concealed beneath her skirt. Thomas stood beside her, his rifle cradled casually in his arms, while Sarah took up a position near the back door where she could cover any attempt to approach the house from the rear. The 3 riders came into view as they crested the small hill that marked the entrance to the Mitchell property, and Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the central figure. Vincent Castellano looked exactly as she remembered him, impeccably dressed, radiating the confident arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and financial pressure. His 2 companions were clearly hired muscle, the kind of men who solved problems with violence rather than negotiation. Vincent dismounted with theatrical flourish and walked toward the house with the measured stride of someone who believed himself to be in complete control of the situation. His eyes found Isabella in the window, and he smiled, the same predatory expression that had haunted her nightmares for months. "Isabella, my dear," Vincent called out, his voice carrying the false warmth that she remembered all too well. "You've led me on quite an adventure, but it's time to end this foolishness and come home where you belong." Thomas stepped onto the porch, his rifle no longer casually held, but clearly ready for immediate use. "Mr. Castellano, I presume. You're not welcome on my property. I suggest you turn around and head back to wherever you came from." Vincent's laugh was cold and calculating. "And you must be the frontier nobody who thinks he can steal my property. How refreshing to meet someone so delightfully naive about the realities of power and influence." "The only reality you need to understand," Thomas replied evenly, "is that you're trespassing on private property and threatening my wife. That makes you subject to territorial law, not Chicago politics." "Your wife?" Vincent's voice carried genuine amusement. "Oh, my dear Thomas, Isabella didn't tell you the truth about our relationship, did she? She's not free to marry anyone. She belongs to me, has belonged to me for years. This little charade of frontier domesticity is nothing more than an elaborate form of theft." Isabella felt rage building in her chest as Vincent spoke, the same manipulative words he had used to control and isolate her in Chicago. But this time, instead of cowering in fear, she found herself moving toward the door with determined purpose. "That's enough," Isabella said, stepping onto the porch beside Thomas, her voice carrying a strength that made Vincent's confident expression falter slightly. "I don't belong to you, Vincent. I never belonged to you. I was trapped by your threats and manipulation, but that's over now." Vincent's mask of civilized charm slipped, revealing the violent obsession that had driven him across a continent in pursuit of a woman who had dared to escape his control. "You're making a serious mistake, Isabella," he said, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone she remembered from their worst confrontations. "I've invested considerable time and resources in tracking you down, and I don't intend to return to Chicago empty-handed. You can come willingly, or I can take you by force. Either way, you're leaving with me today." "Actually," came a new voice from behind Vincent, "she's not going anywhere." Marshal Hughes stepped into view from behind one of the outbuildings, his badge clearly visible and his hand resting on his holstered weapon. His 2 deputies emerged from their positions, creating a triangle of official authority that surrounded Vincent and his men. "Vincent Castellano," Marshal Hughes continued formally. "You're under arrest for interstate stalking, criminal threatening, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right." Vincent's face cycled through surprise, rage, and calculation as he assessed his suddenly deteriorated position. His hired men were reaching for their weapons when the distinctive sound of multiple rifles being cocked echoed across the ranch yard. The neighboring ranchers had emerged from their concealed positions, their weapons trained on Vincent's companions, with the steady competence of men who knew how to shoot and weren't afraid to do so if necessary. "I wouldn't recommend that," Thomas said conversationally to Vincent's men. "You're outnumbered about 10 to 1, and every man here is a better shot than you'll ever be." Vincent's hired muscles slowly raised their hands, recognizing the futility of resistance when faced with overwhelming odds and determined opposition. "This is harassment," Vincent protested, his voice high with indignation. "I'm a legitimate businessman pursuing my legal rights. These territorial marshals have no jurisdiction over matters of personal property and contractual obligations." Actually, Marshal Hughes replied with evident satisfaction, "Interstate pursuit of victims for the purpose of kidnapping is very much within federal jurisdiction. And thanks to the excellent cooperation of the Chicago Police Department, we have quite a file on your activities back east." Isabella stared at the marshal in amazement. "Chicago Police Department? Turns out you weren't Vincent's only victim," Hughes explained. 3 other women filed complaints against him over the past 2 years, but he was too well connected for local law enforcement to touch. When we contacted them about your situation, they were more than happy to cooperate with a federal investigation. The revelation that Vincent had terrorized other women filled Isabella with a mixture of horror and vindication. Her instincts about his dangerous nature had been correct, and his pursuit of her was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior. "You can't prove anything," Vincent snarled. But Isabella could see the desperation beginning to crack his facade of arrogant confidence. "It's the word of some hysterical women against a respected businessman." "Actually," Isabella said, surprising herself with the steady strength of her own voice, "we can prove quite a lot. I kept records, Vincent. Dates, times, witnesses to your threats. Everything you said and did, carefully documented and hidden where you could never find it." Vincent's face went white as he realized the implications of Isabella's revelation. In his arrogance, he had never considered that his victim might be systematically building a case against him, gathering evidence that could be used to hold him accountable for his actions. "Impossible," he whispered. "You were too frightened, too broken to plan anything that's sophisticated." "You're right that I was frightened," Isabella replied, stepping closer to Vincent with each word. "But you underestimated my intelligence and my determination to survive. Every threat you made, every act of violence, every time you tried to isolate me from potential help, I recorded it all." As the marshals placed Vincent and his men in shackles, Isabella felt something profound shift inside her chest. The fear that had ruled her life for so long was dissolving, replaced by a sense of justice finally being served and a future finally within her grasp. "Where are those records now?" Marshal Hughes asked as they prepared to transport the prisoners. To the territorial courthouse, Isabella smiled. The first genuine, unrestrained smile anyone had seen from her since her arrival in Montana. "Safe in Chicago," she said, "in the hands of a lawyer who's been waiting for the right moment to present them to a federal grand jury. Vincent's arrest here will trigger their release, along with testimony from his other victims who were afraid to come forward while he remained free." Vincent's expression showed that he finally understood the scope of what was happening to him. His pursuit of Isabella hadn't just led to his own capture, it had exposed him to prosecution for years of systematic abuse and intimidation. As the Prisoners were loaded into the wagon that would take them to face federal charges. Thomas took Isabella's hand in his own. "It's over," he said simply, and Isabella could hear the wonder in his voice at how completely their careful preparations had succeeded. "Yes," Isabella replied, looking around at the friends and neighbors who had risked themselves to protect her, at Sarah beaming with pride from the porch, at Thomas whose love had given her the strength to stop running and start fighting. It's finally over. The nightmare that had driven her from Chicago was ending, but more importantly, the new life she had built in Montana was just beginning. Isabella Martinez Mitchell was free at last. Free to love, free to build, free to become whoever she chose to be in this vast, beautiful, challenging territory that had become her true home. The weeks following Vincent's arrest brought an unexpected challenge to Isabella's newfound freedom, learning how to live without fear. For so long, her life had been structured around avoiding danger, anticipating threats, and maintaining constant vigilance. Now, with Vincent facing federal charges and multiple testimonies from other victims ensuring his conviction, Isabella found herself adrift in the strange territory of genuine safety. The first sign of this adjustment came 3 days after Vincent's capture, when Isabella woke from her first full night's sleep in over 2 years. She had slept so deeply that she didn't hear Thomas leave for his morning chores, didn't register Sarah starting breakfast, didn't wake until the sun was already painting her bedroom walls with golden winter light. "I overslept," Isabella said apologetically as she hurried into the kitchen, still tying her robe around her waist. "You slept," Sarah corrected gently, not looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "For the first time since you arrived here, you slept like someone who didn't need to keep one ear listening for trouble. That's not oversleeping, that's healing." The observation stayed with Isabella throughout the morning as she went about her usual tasks with a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. Everything felt different. The weight of dishes in her hands, the rhythm of sweeping floors, even the quality of winter light streaming through familiar windows. It was as if a heavy filter had been removed from her perception, allowing her to see and feel with clarity she had forgotten was possible. Thomas noticed the change immediately when he returned from checking the cattle. Isabella was humming while she worked. Not the unconscious melody of distraction, but the purposeful song of someone who felt genuinely content. When their eyes met across the kitchen, Thomas's face lit up with a smile that transformed his weather-beaten features into something approaching boyish joy. "You look different," he said, settling into his chair for the midday meal. "Lighter somehow." Isabella paused in her task of slicing fresh bread, considering his observation. "I feel different. Like I've been holding my breath for years and can finally exhale completely." It was during this meal that Thomas raised a subject that had been weighing on both their minds since Vincent's arrest: the nature of their marriage and what it meant now that Isabella was truly free to choose her own future. "Isabella," Thomas began carefully, "I want you to know that you're not bound by our arrangement now that the immediate danger has passed. You married me for protection and safety, and you found both. But if you want to return to Chicago or go somewhere else entirely, I'll understand completely." The offer was made with such genuine selflessness that Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes. Thomas was giving her the freedom to leave him, despite his obvious feelings for her, because he believed it was what her complete liberation required. "Where would I go?" Isabella asked, her voice soft with emotion. "Chicago holds nothing but painful memories. I have no family left there, no friends who weren't frightened away by Vincent's threats. This ranch, this community, you and Sarah, this is the first real home I've had since my parents died." Thomas's relief was evident, but he pressed the point with characteristic honesty. "Home is one thing, but marriage is another. You agreed to be my wife under duress when you had limited options. Now that you're truly free, you should have the chance to choose whether that's what you really want." Isabella set down her bread, knife, and moved to sit beside Thomas, taking his weathered hands in her own smaller ones. The gesture felt natural now, free of the nervous tension that had characterized their early interactions. "Thomas Mitchell," she said with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in their acquaintance, "are you asking me to court you properly? After I've already been living in your house for weeks, helping Sarah run your household and learning every detail of ranch management." Thomas actually blushed, the color rising in his cheeks like a schoolboy caught stealing apples. "I suppose I am. It seems only fair that you should have the chance to fall in love with someone by choice rather than circumstance." "And what if I told you that I already have?" Isabella replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute conviction. The kiss that followed was their first, tender, hesitant, and filled with the profound relief of two people who had found each other against impossible odds. When they separated, both were smiling with the giddy happiness of teenagers discovering romance for the first time. "Well, it's about time," Sarah announced from the doorway, her arms crossed, but her expression radiating maternal satisfaction. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other until spring arrived." The laughter that filled the kitchen was unlike anything the Mitchell Ranch had heard in years, pure, unguarded joy that seemed to lift the very walls with its intensity. The formal courtship that followed was unlike any romantic relationship Isabella had ever experienced. Thomas approached her affections with the same patient consideration he brought to everything else, creating opportunities for them to discover each other's thoughts, dreams, and personalities without the pressure of their original practical arrangement. Their first official courting outing was a trip to town for supplies, but Thomas had arranged it like a proper social engagement. He hired Miguel to drive the wagon so he could sit beside Isabella without the distraction of handling horses, brought a basket lunch that Sarah had prepared with special care, and took a longer route that showed Isabella parts of the territory she hadn't yet seen. "Tell me about your dreams," Thomas said as they watched the landscape roll by beneath a crystalline winter sky. "Not your fears or your survival plans, your actual dreams. What did you want to become when you were a girl?" The question caught Isabella off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her aspirations rather than her immediate needs that she had to think carefully about her answer. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said finally. "I loved learning, loved the idea of helping children discover the joy of reading and mathematics. Before I met Vincent, I was taking classes at the Women's College in Chicago, studying pedagogy and literature." Thomas listened with the focused attention he gave to everything Isabella shared, as if her words carried the weight of precious information that needed to be carefully preserved. "What stopped you from finishing your studies?" Isabella's expression darkened briefly as she remembered. "Vincent convinced me that educated women made inferior wives, that my intellectual pursuits were selfish distractions from my proper role. By the time I realized he was deliberately isolating me from everything that brought me confidence and joy, I had already withdrawn from college and alienated my professors." "Would you like to teach here?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Clearwater Junction has been trying to establish a proper school for years, but they've never found anyone qualified who was willing to stay in such an isolated community." The suggestion sparked something in Isabella that had been dormant for years: professional ambition, intellectual excitement, the sense of purpose that came from meaningful work. The idea of creating an educational foundation for the children of frontier families appealed to her in ways that went far beyond personal fulfillment. "Do you think they would accept a woman teacher who arrived as a mail-order bride?" "I think they would be grateful for anyone with your education and character," Thomas replied firmly. This community has seen how you handled yourself under pressure, how you've contributed to ranch operations, how you've won Sarah's complete approval. Your past circumstances matter far less than your present character." The conversation continued as they completed their errands in town, with Thomas introducing Isabella to prominent citizens as his wife rather than simply his domestic arrangement. She noticed how naturally he included her in discussions of community affairs, how he deferred to her opinions on matters where her education gave her expertise, how he presented her as a full partner rather than an ornamental appendage. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson, the merchant's wife, approached Isabella with a proposition that proved Thomas's assessment accurate. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said warmly, "I hope you'll forgive my directness, but Thomas mentioned you have teaching experience. We've been trying to organize proper schooling for our children, but we need someone qualified to lead the effort. Would you consider meeting with some of the other mothers to discuss possibilities?" Isabella accepted the invitation with enthusiasm that surprised her own expectations. The prospect of building something meaningful from scratch, of contributing her skills to the community's development, filled her with anticipation she hadn't felt since her college days. The first informal meeting of prospective parents took place the following week in the Mitchell Ranch parlor, with Sarah providing refreshments and Thomas contributing practical perspectives on logistics and funding. Isabella found herself naturally taking leadership of the discussion, drawing on her interrupted education to propose curriculum ideas and organizational structures. "We could start with basic literacy and arithmetic," Isabella explained to the gathered mothers and fathers, "then expand to include geography, natural sciences, and practical skills relevant to frontier life. The key is creating a foundation that will serve children whether they choose to stay in the territory or pursue opportunities elsewhere." The enthusiasm of the parents was infectious, and by the end of the evening they had formed a school board, with Isabella as the designated teacher and curriculum developer. The position would provide her with a modest salary and, more importantly, a professional identity that was entirely her own choice. "I'm proud of you," Thomas said that night as they sat by the fire, planning the practical details of establishing the schoolhouse. "Watching you take charge of that meeting, seeing how excited you got about educational philosophy, that's the woman you were always meant to be." Isabella leaned against Thomas's shoulder, marveling at how natural the gesture felt after weeks of careful courtship and growing intimacy. "I never thought I could have this," she said softly. "A career, a marriage built on mutual respect, a community where I'm valued for my contributions rather than just tolerated for my compliance." "You always could have had it," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Vincent stole years from you by convincing you otherwise, but he never actually changed who you were underneath all that fear." The winter months that followed were marked by steady progress on multiple fronts. Isabella threw herself into developing the school curriculum with the passion of someone finally able to use her intellectual gifts constructively. She corresponded with former professors in Chicago who sent boxes of textbooks and educational materials, transforming one corner of the ranch house into a temporary classroom for planning purposes. Meanwhile, her relationship with Thomas deepened from arrangement to genuine partnership. They worked together on ranch projects, with Isabella's bookkeeping skills proving invaluable for long-term financial planning. She helped him research new breeding techniques for improving cattle stock, while he supported her educational initiatives, with practical solutions for heating, furnishing, and equipping the planned schoolhouse. Most importantly, Isabella discovered that marriage to Thomas was everything her relationship with Vincent had never been, a collaboration between equals, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than control and possession. The first letter from Chicago arrived in February, bearing news that finally closed the book on Isabella's painful past. Vincent had been convicted on federal charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. His other victims had come forward during the trial, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that left no doubt about his guilt or the danger he had posed to the women he had targeted. "It's finally over," Isabella said, holding the letter that officially ended the nightmare that had driven her from her old life. "No," Thomas corrected gently, taking the letter and setting it aside so he could focus entirely on his wife's face. "Your new life is just beginning." He was right. Isabella Martinez. Mitchell was no longer running from her past. She was building toward a future filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Spring was coming to Montana, bringing with it the promise of new growth, new opportunities, and the chance to help build something lasting and meaningful in this vast, challenging, beautiful territory that had become her true home. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Clearwater Junction had become someone entirely new, a teacher, a wife, a community leader, and most importantly, a woman who had learned that love wasn't about possession or control, but about creating space for each other to grow and flourish. Isabella had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world, and she intended to use all three to build a life worthy of the courage it had taken to claim it. 1 year later, Isabella stood in the doorway of the newly completed Clearwater Junction schoolhouse, watching 23 children from across the territory recite their lessons with enthusiasm that warmed her heart. The building itself was a testament to community cooperation, built with lumber donated by the local mill, furnished with desks crafted by every carpenter in the region, and equipped with books and supplies funded by contributions from ranchers, who understood that education was an investment in their territory's future. Mrs. Mitchell called out 8-year-old Annie Davis, her hand raised high with the urgency that characterized all her academic questions. "Why do we need to learn about places so far away when everything we need is right here in Montana?" Isabella smiled at the question, recognizing in Annie's bright curiosity an echo of her own intellectual hunger at that age. "Because knowledge connects us to the wider world, Annie. Someday you might choose to see those distant places yourself, or perhaps people from those places will come here and you'll be able to understand and help them." The answer satisfied Annie, who nodded sagely and returned to her geography primer with renewed focus. Isabella had discovered that frontier children possessed a natural hunger for learning that urban students often lacked, perhaps because education represented genuine opportunity in a place where intelligence and determination could overcome limitations of birth or circumstance. As afternoon lessons concluded and children dispersed to their various homesteads, Isabella began preparing the schoolhouse for the evening's special event, a community celebration marking the first anniversary of her arrival in Clearwater Junction. The timing seemed perfect. Exactly 1 year after stepping off the train as a frightened refugee, she would be honored as the territory's first certified teacher and one of its most valued citizens. Thomas arrived as Isabella was arranging chairs for the evening's festivities, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who had spent the day completing meaningful work. Over the past year, their marriage had evolved into the kind of partnership Isabella had once thought existed only in romantic novels. Two people who strengthened each other while pursuing individual dreams that complemented rather than competed. "How were the lessons today?" Thomas asked, settling into one of the student desks with exaggerated care that made Isabella laugh. "Exceptional as always. Your neighbor's boy, Michael Wilson, is showing remarkable aptitude for mathematics. I think he has the potential to pursue engineering if he chooses to attend university back east." Thomas nodded with the pride of a community member invested in every child's success. The school had become a source of territorial pride, attracting families from neighboring regions who wanted their children to receive quality education. Some had even established permanent homesteads in the area specifically to access Isabella's teaching. "I have news," Thomas said, his tone carrying an excitement that immediately captured Isabella's attention. "The territorial governor wants to visit next month. Apparently, word has reached Helena about our school's success, and he's interested in using our model for other rural communities." Isabella felt a familiar flutter of pride, mixed with nervous anticipation. The recognition was gratifying, but it also represented new responsibilities and opportunities that would require careful consideration. "There's more," Thomas continued, pulling an official-looking letter from his coat pocket. "They're offering you a position as territorial education supervisor. You would travel throughout Montana, helping other communities establish schools, using the methods you've developed here." The offer represented everything Isabella had once dreamed of achieving: professional recognition, the opportunity to shape educational policy, and the chance to impact hundreds of children's lives across the territory. But it also meant extended travel away from Clearwater Junction, away from Thomas and the life they had built together. "What do you think?" Isabella asked, knowing that Thomas's opinion would be crucial to her decision. "I think," Thomas said, carefully, "that you've become too valuable to keep to ourselves. These children will always be grateful for the foundation you've given them. But there are hundreds of other children throughout the territory who deserve the same opportunity." Isabella appreciated Thomas's characteristic selflessness, but she could also see the cost such a decision would exact on their personal relationship. The territory was vast, and the travel required for such a position would mean weeks away from home at a time. "I don't want to sacrifice our marriage for professional advancement," Isabella said honestly. "I spent too many years having my choices made for me to accept a position that requires choosing between love and career." Thomas's face lit up with the smile that had become Isabella's favorite sight in the world. "What if you didn't have to choose? What if there was a way to do both?" Before Isabella could ask what he meant, Sarah appeared in the schoolhouse doorway carrying a basket that smelled tantalizingly of fresh baking. Behind her came a procession of neighbors bearing dishes for the evening celebration. The Henderson family with their famous apple pies, Miguel Santos carrying a guitar for the evening's music, and the Wilson family with their children already, dressed in their finest clothes. "Time for speeches later," Sarah announced with the authority of someone who had appointed herself celebration coordinator. "Right now we have a party to organize and a very special woman to honor." The celebration that followed exceeded Isabella's expectations in both scope and emotional impact. What had begun as a simple community gathering evolved into something approaching a county fair, with families traveling from homesteads 50 miles away to participate in honoring their territorial teacher. Mayor Henderson, elected just 6 months earlier, delivered a speech praising Isabella's contributions to regional development. Sheriff Watson presented her with an official commendation from territorial law enforcement for her role in helping convict Vincent and his criminal associates. Most meaningfully, the children she had taught performed a dramatic presentation about the importance of education that brought tears to every adult eye in the audience. But the evening's most significant moment came when Thomas took the makeshift stage and addressed the gathered community with words that would be remembered long after the last guest had departed for home. "Friends and neighbors," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "we gather tonight to celebrate a woman who came to us seeking safety and gave us far more than we could have hoped to provide in return. Isabella Martinez arrived in Clearwater Junction as a stranger in need, But she became family, teacher, leader, and the heart of our community's growth. Isabella felt tears beginning to form as Thomas continued, his words painting a picture of transformation that seemed almost too remarkable to have happened to her. But tonight isn't just about celebrating Isabella's contributions to our community, Thomas said, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. It's about announcing our decision to expand those contributions throughout the territory. Isabella's breath caught as Thomas explained their plan. She would accept the territorial education position, but they would travel together. Thomas would serve as her assistant and logistics coordinator, using his ranching experience to help establish agricultural education programs alongside traditional academic subjects. We've decided that Montana needs couples who are willing to build institutions together, Thomas concluded. Isabella will teach the children, and I'll help their families develop sustainable farming and ranching practices. Together, we'll plant seeds of knowledge and prosperity that will grow for generations. The crowd's enthusiastic approval was immediate and overwhelming, but Isabella barely heard the applause. Her attention was focused entirely on Thomas, on the man who had found a way to support her professional dreams, while strengthening rather than sacrificing their marriage. As the celebration continued around them, Isabella and Thomas found a quiet moment together outside the schoolhouse, standing beneath the vast Montana sky that had witnessed her transformation from victim to victor. "Ah, you certain about this?" Isabella asked, still amazed by the elegant solution Thomas had proposed to her professional dilemma. "I've never been more certain of anything," Thomas replied, taking her hands in his own familiar grasp. "I fell in love with your mind and your strength, Isabella. Why would I want to limit either one?" The kiss they shared was witnessed only by the stars and the endless prairie that stretched toward horizons bright with possibility. Isabella had traveled far from the broken woman who had fled Chicago in terror, but more importantly, she had traveled deeper into herself, discovering reserves of courage, intelligence, and love that Vincent's abuse had hidden but never destroyed. As the last guests departed and they prepared to close the schoolhouse for the evening, Isabella reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened, mail-order bride who had never smiled had become a woman whose laughter filled rooms and whose dreams shaped the future of an entire territory. "Thank you," Isabella whispered to Thomas as they walked home together beneath the star-filled Montana sky. "For what? For seeing who I could become when I couldn't see it myself. For believing in my strength when I had forgotten I possessed any. For loving me enough to help me remember how to love myself." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face Isabella directly, his expression serious but radiating the quiet happiness that had become characteristic of their life together. "Isabella Mitchell," he said softly, "you saved yourself. You had the courage to leave, the wisdom to seek safety, and the strength to rebuild your life from nothing. I just provided the space for you to remember who you always were." As they reached their home, their ranch, their sanctuary, their launching point for future adventures, Isabella realized that her story had come full circle. She had arrived in Montana running from her past, but she was leaving to embrace her future. The woman who had once been too broken to smile had become someone whose joy was powerful enough to light up the darkest Montana winter night. The mail order bride, who had married for protection, had discovered a love worth traveling to the ends of the earth to preserve and share. And the teacher who had once doubted her own worth had become someone capable of shaping the minds and hearts of an entire generation. Isabella Martinez Mitchell was finally, completely, joyfully home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen, If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.